Corinne Corey Blackwood shuffled nervously through the busy corridors of Crestwood Academy, her faded rucksack bumping against her skinny frame. Scarcely topping 5'2", with unruly raven braids that defied every attempt to tame them, she discovered early that blending in was her only defense. Her baggy, olive-green hoodie hung loosely on her petite body, carefully selected to conceal her fragile form beneath layers of material. Round, tortoise-shell spectacles perched precariously on her button nose, forever sliding down as she rushed between classes. She had enrolled at Crestwood only 2 semesters prior, when her traveling nurse mother had accepted a new position, and adjusting had proven harder than any of their previous moves. The campus sprawled across several blocks in suburban Oak Haven, its weathered stone facade accommodating nearly 1,500 teenagers who seemed to navigate the social landscape with an ease that totally escaped her. Mostly, Corey managed to pass unnoticed, eating her packed lunch alone in the computer lab and keeping quiet during group projects. Unbeknownst to her fellow pupils, Corey had spent the past 6 years training in Aikido at community centers across 4 different states. Her mother, a practical woman, had insisted she learn self-defense due to their constant relocations. Every morning before lectures and every evening after homework, she practiced stances, throws, and evasion techniques in their cramped apartment. Her small build was deceptive. Beneath that baggy clothing lay wiry muscle and cat-like reflexes honed by countless hours of practice. But Corey had made a deal with her mother before starting at Crestwood. No fighting unless absolutely essential, no attracting attention, no risking the academic problems that could jeopardize her mother's nursing career. So she tolerated the giggles when she fumbled her books, the muttered remarks about her hand-me-down clothes, and the way other pupils seemed to stare right through her. The problem truly began during her 3rd week when she accidentally collided with Ethan Sterling near the debate club notice board. Ethan stood a towering 6'2", with immaculately styled dark hair, and the kind of confident air that came from being captain of the basketball team. His designer bomber jacket stretched across his broad shoulders, and his dark eyes held the cold detachment of someone used to getting his way. "Look where you're going, dweeb," Ethan had scoffed, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby teenagers. When Corey mumbled an apology and tried to move on, he snatched her rucksack and flung it off her shoulder. "I'm talking to you, 4 Eyes." Corey's training instincts screamed at her to react, to use the force of his grip against him, but her mother's warnings rang louder. She merely picked up her scattered notebooks, while Ethan's cronies, Owen Fisher and Caleb Ramirez, snickered and made jokes about her thrift store shoes. The incidents escalated slowly. Ethan and his gang would accidentally bump into her in the lunch hall, sending her simple sandwich tumbling to the floor. They'd knock folders from her grasp in the corridor, then kick her worksheets as she tried to gather them. During physical education, Owen would hurl dodgeballs straight at her head, claiming it was part of the game, while their instructor, Mr. Harrison, remained conveniently preoccupied. The worst incidents occurred in the art department's west staircase, a dingy passage between floors that most pupils avoided because of poor lighting and the way echoes bounced off the tiled walls. Ethan discovered that Corey used this route to avoid crowds, and he started timing his appearances to coincide with hers. He'd trap her on the landing between the 1st and 2nd floors, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the faint odor of chewing gum. "Nobody even knows you exist here," he'd whisper, standing just close enough to make her uncomfortable without actually touching her. "You could vanish tomorrow and not a single soul would notice." Corey would press herself against the cool, tiled wall, her fists clenched tightly at her sides, fighting every urge that told her to strike first and ask questions later. She'd think about her mother's upcoming performance review, about the disappointment in her eyes if she got suspended for fighting. So she'd wait until Ethan got bored and wandered off, then spend the rest of the day trying to stop her hands from trembling. The pattern persisted for weeks. Ethan seemed to derive particular pleasure in targeting her during lunch breaks, when the lunch hall was crammed with observers who either laughed along or deliberately looked away. He'd stroll past her table, a small corner spot near the recycling bins where she ate alone, and accidentally spill her water bottle or sweep her food onto the floor. His cronies would provide commentary, calling her names that made her cheeks flush with shame and anger. "Look, it's the ghost girl," Owen would announce whenever they spotted her. "Bet she doesn't even have buddies back wherever she came from." Caleb preferred physical intimidation, using his height advantage to tower over her whenever she tried to access her locker. He'd slam the metal door shut just as she reached for her textbooks, sometimes catching her fingers in the process. When she'd gasp in pain, he'd mockingly ask if she needed to visit the first aid room, then chuckle when she shook her head and hurried away. Throughout it all, Corey observed other pupils' reactions, or lack thereof. Her lab partner in biology, a shy boy named Leo, would glance sympathetically in her direction, but never speak up when Ethan made loud remarks about Corey's appearance. The pupils who sat near her in history class would shift uncomfortably when Owen accidentally kicked her chair repeatedly, but they kept their eyes glued to their textbooks and said nothing. Even the teachers seemed determined to maintain plausible deniability. Ms. Davison would frown when disturbances occurred in her classroom, but somehow always missed the moment when Ethan whispered cruel remarks or Owen flicked paper clips at Corey's head. Mr. Johnson actually witnessed Caleb trip her in the hallway outside his classroom, sending her textbooks scattering across the polished floor, but simply reminded all pupils to be more careful without addressing the obvious intention of the action. The final straw came on a Wednesday in early November, when the autumn chill still made the school's aging heating system struggle to keep up. Corey had been looking forward to lunch break because she'd finally finished her digital design project, a detailed rendering of a griffin taking flight that had taken her months to complete. She planned to submit it that afternoon for the school's annual technology showcase, one of the few activities where her quiet nature might actually be an advantage. She was carefully placing the design on her tablet when she noticed Jasper Bellwether approaching her table. Jasper was different from most pupils at Crestwood. He favored art museums to sporting events, wore vintage rock band shirts instead of designer brands, and had gentle hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses similar to her own. He'd been the only pupil to offer genuine sympathy when she'd dropped her entire lunch tray 3 weeks earlier, even helping her clean up the mess while Ethan and his cronies laughed from across the lunch hall. "Hey, Corey," Jasper said softly, sliding into the seat across from her. "Mind if I sit here? The debate club meeting got cancelled, and eating alone gets pretty depressing." Corey felt her heart flutter as she nodded, carefully closing her tablet to protect her artwork. Jasper was the first person at Crestwood to seek out her company willingly, and she found herself actually smiling as they talked about their shared love of graphic novels and fantasy movies. For 15 precious minutes, she forgot about Ethan Sterling and his cruel games. That's when Ethan appeared at their table, Owen and Caleb flanking him like bodyguards. His eyes were cold with the particular anger he reserved for situations he couldn't control, and Corey realized immediately that her brief moment of happiness had somehow threatened his carefully maintained social order. "Well, well," Ethan said, his voice carrying across the nearby tables. "Looks like the dweeb found another dweeb to hang out with." Jasper looked up calmly, though Corey could see tension in his shoulders. "Is there something you need, Ethan?" "What I need," Ethan replied, reaching over to grab Corey's tablet, "is to see what our little artist has been working on so secretively." Corey's training kicked in automatically. She moved to intercept his hand with a defensive block that would have redirected his momentum and potentially sprained his wrist. But at the last second, her mother's warnings flooded her mind, and she hesitated just long enough for Ethan to snatch the tablet away. "Please," she whispered, standing up from her chair, "just give it back." Ethan opened the tablet with theatrical flourish, displaying her griffin drawing for the surrounding tables to see. "Oh, look, everyone! The ghost girl made us a picture." Several pupils turned to watch, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable amusement to outright curiosity. Corey felt her face burning as Ethan continued his performance, waving her artwork around like a trophy. "You know what this needs?" Owen said, producing a carton of orange juice from his lunch bag. "Some color." "No!" Corey lunged forward, but Caleb caught her arm, his grip tight enough to leave marks. She watched helplessly as Owen poured orange juice across her drawing, the bright liquid soaking through the screen and destroying months of careful work. Jasper stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's enough. Leave her alone." Ethan's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing with the predatory focus that Corey had learned to fear. "Or what, book boy? You gonna protect your little girlfriend?" "She's not—" Jasper started, but Ethan was already moving. What happened next felt like slow motion to Corey. Ethan grabbed the front of Jasper's vintage Pink Floyd shirt and shoved him backward, sending him stumbling into another table. Pupils scattered as Jasper tried to regain his balance, his glasses flying off his face and skittering across the linoleum floor. "Oops," Ethan said mockingly. "Looks like Loverboy is clumsier than his girlfriend." The lunch hall had gone silent, except for a few nervous giggles from Ethan's usual audience. Corey looked around desperately for a teacher, for any adult who might intervene, but the lunch monitors were conveniently absent from this section of the room. Ethan turned his attention back to her, and she saw something new in his expression, a cruel excitement that made her stomach churn. "You know what? I think it's time we helped you find some school spirit." Before she could react, he grabbed the hem of her baggy olive-green hoodie and yanked upward. The zipper broke, sending the metal teeth scattering across the floor as he pulled the fabric over her head. Corey's plain grey t-shirt provided little coverage, and she could hear gasps and whispers from the watching pupils as she stood there exposed and humiliated. Time seemed frozen for a moment that felt like eternity. Corey stood in the center of the lunch hall, her hoodie in Ethan's hands, wearing only a thin t-shirt that left her feeling completely vulnerable. She could see Jasper struggling to find his glasses, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. She could hear the whispers starting, the sound of phones being pulled out to capture her humiliation for social media posterity. But most of all, she could see Ethan's triumphant smile, the satisfaction in his eyes as he achieved what he considered the ultimate victory over someone he deemed unworthy of basic human dignity. That's when 6 years of training took over. Corey moved faster than Ethan's reflexes could process. Her right palm shot forward in a perfect Shuto strike, connecting with his throat with enough force to momentarily cut off his air supply. The impact made him gasp, and his grip on her hoodie went slack as his hands instinctively moved to clutch his injured neck. Ethan's eyes went wide with shock and pain as he staggered backward, struggling to breathe. Corey caught her hoodie as it fell, quickly pulling it back on despite the broken zipper. But she wasn't finished. Owen rushed forward to help his friend, but Corey was already in motion. She sidestepped his clumsy advance and executed a perfect Tai Sabaki, redirecting his momentum and sending him sprawling into Caleb. Both boys went down in a tangle of limbs, Owen gasping for air and Caleb swearing as he tried to untangle himself from his friend's flailing arms. The lunch hall erupted in shouts and exclamations. Pupils jumped on tables to get better views. Phones appeared everywhere to record the unprecedented sight of Ethan Sterling and his crew, being systematically dismantled by the quiet girl they'd tormented for months. Ethan had managed to straighten up somewhat, though he was still holding his throat and breathing heavily. His face was flushed red with humiliation and rage as he realized that dozens of his classmates were witnessing his defeat at the hands of someone he'd considered beneath his notice. "You little—" he started, lunging forward with his fists raised. Corey ducked under his clumsy attack with fluid grace, grabbing his extended arm and executing a perfect kote gaishi, a wrist lock that sent him sprawling across a nearby table. Lunch trays went flying, and Ethan landed face first in a pile of mashed potatoes and gravy, his perfectly styled hair now dripping with lunch hall food. Caleb had finally gotten back to his feet and circled around behind her, trying to grab her arms and pin them to her sides. But Corey had been training for situations exactly like this since she was 10 years old. She dropped her weight and executed a perfect Ushiro Ukemi, a backward roll that allowed her to escape his grasp and sweep his legs out from under him with a move her sensei had made her practice thousands of times. Caleb hit the floor hard, his head connecting with the linoleum with a sound that made several pupils wince. He lay there groaning, completely dazed, and showing no inclination to continue the fight. Owen was still on his knees, holding his stomach and trying to catch his breath. He looked up at Corey with newfound respect and more than a little fear, clearly reconsidering any thoughts he might have had about joining the conflict. Ethan slowly pushed himself up from the table, mashed potatoes sliding off his face as he tried to regain some semblance of dignity. His designer polo shirt was stained with gravy. His perfectly styled hair was a mess, and his dark eyes held the shell-shocked expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered. "How did you—" he started, but his voice came out as more of a wheeze. Corey stood in the center of the chaos, breathing normally despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Her hoodie hung open, held together only by the bottom 2 strands of the broken zipper, but her posture radiated confidence for the first time since she'd arrived at Crestwood. She looked down at Ethan, who was still struggling to clean food from his face, and felt a surge of power that was both intoxicating and dangerous. For a moment, every instinct screamed at her to finish what he'd started. Ethan was vulnerable, humiliated, completely at her mercy. She could easily put him down permanently, could make him feel the same helplessness and fear he'd inflicted on her for months. Her training had taught her dozens of ways to inflict serious damage, and part of her wanted to use every single one. But as she looked around the silent lunch hall, she saw Jasper struggling to find his glasses, his face bruised from where he'd hit the table. She saw other pupils watching with expressions ranging from shock to admiration, to fear. And she remembered her mother's words about the difference between strength and cruelty, between defending yourself and becoming the monster you fought against. "Get up," she said quietly, extending her hand toward Ethan. He stared at her extended hand as if it might bite him, his eyes darting between her face and the dozens of pupils recording everything on their phones. After a long moment, he grudgingly accepted her help, allowing her to pull him to his feet, despite the obvious humiliation of needing assistance from someone he'd considered weak. "This isn't over," Ethan muttered, but his voice lacked its usual authority. He was still holding his throat, and his face had gone pale beneath the food stains. "Yes, it is," Corey replied calmly. "And if you ever touch me or anyone else like that again, next time, I won't pull my punches." The lunch hall remained silent for several more seconds before erupting into chaos. Pupils rushed forward, some to check on the injured boys, others to congratulate Corey or ask how she'd learned to fight like that. Several people offered her their own jackets to replace her damaged hoodie, while others helped Jasper locate his glasses and offered ice for his bruises. Within minutes, the story had spread throughout the school via social media and text messages. Videos of the fight circulated faster than the administration could confiscate phones, and by the end of the day, Corey Blackwood had gone from invisible nobody to school legend. The immediate aftermath brought a parade of administrators, phone calls to parents, and lengthy meetings in the headmaster's office. But witness testimony was overwhelming. Dozens of pupils came forward to describe months of escalating harassment, the deliberate humiliation, and Ethan's final assault that had triggered Corey's response. Security cameras confirmed their accounts, showing Ethan grabbing her hoodie while she tried to cover herself and retreat. Ethan Sterling received a 2-week suspension for assault and harassment. Owen and Caleb got 3 days each for their participation. All 3 were required to complete anger management counseling and write formal apologies that would be read aloud during morning announcements. Corey received 1 day of in-school suspension for fighting, but the punishment felt more like a formality than genuine discipline. Even Headmaster Davies seemed privately pleased that someone had finally stood up to Ethan's behavior, though he couldn't officially condone violence as a solution to bullying. The changes at Crestwood were immediate and dramatic. Pupils who had previously looked through Corey now approached her with curious respect, wanting to know about her Aikido background and how she'd learned to fight. Teachers who had been conveniently blind to the harassment suddenly became much more attentive to classroom dynamics. More importantly, other pupils who had been targets of Ethan's cruelty found their voices. Leo from biology class admitted he'd wanted to help, but had been afraid of becoming a target himself. Several freshmen came forward with their own stories of intimidation and harassment. The culture of fear that Ethan had carefully cultivated began to crumble as people realized he was neither invincible nor untouchable. Jasper became a regular presence at Corey's lunch table, their friendship deepening into something that made her heart race whenever he smiled at her. He never asked her to fight his battles, but his quiet support and genuine admiration helped her find balance between her warrior training and her desire to fit in peacefully. Ethan himself underwent the most dramatic transformation. The humiliation of being defeated so publicly, combined with the loss of his social standing, forced him to confront the reality of his behavior. His apology, when it finally came, was awkward, but seemed genuine. "I never thought about how it felt," he admitted during a private conversation 3 weeks after the lunch hall incident. "I guess I figured if you couldn't fight back, you deserved whatever happened to you." Corey studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but found only uncomfortable honesty. "That's not how the world works," she replied. "Being able to hurt someone doesn't give you the right to do it." Ethan nodded slowly, still favoring his left side where her palm strike had connected. "I'm trying to be better. It's harder than I thought it would be." 2 months later, as Corey walked through the halls of Crestwood Academy, she marveled at how completely everything had changed. Pupils called out greetings, invited her to study groups, and asked for her help with their own bullying problems. She'd started an informal self-defense club that met after school, teaching basic techniques to anyone who wanted to learn. She still wore baggy hoodies and kept her unruly braids untamed, but now it felt like a choice rather than camouflage. Her mother had been proud when she'd finally told him about the incident, praising her restraint and her decision to help Ethan up rather than continue the attack. "Real strength," she'd said, "isn't about how much damage you can do. It's about knowing when to stop." The technology showcase had been postponed due to the lunch hall incident, but Corey had submitted a new piece, a drawing of pupils standing together, protecting someone smaller who was being surrounded by larger figures. She called it "Finding Your Voice," and it won first place in the school-wide competition. As she sat in the lunch hall with Jasper and their growing circle of friends, Corey reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd learned that invisibility wasn't always protection, that sometimes the only way to find peace was to be willing to fight for it, and that standing up for yourself didn't have to mean becoming the very thing you fought against. The griffin she'd drawn months earlier was gone, destroyed by orange juice and cruelty. But like the mythical beast it depicted, something new had risen from those ashes, stronger, fiercer, and impossible to ignore.